Matthew Evans eased back in his leather seat, the hum of his silver Mercedes barely audible over the chorus of cicadas outside. The Kentucky heat rippled across the two-lane road in waves, shimmering like a distant mirage. Inside the car, the air conditioning fought a losing battle against the sun's relentless glare. He adjusted the vents, but the cool air did little to temper his growing frustration. A flat tire had stranded him in the middle of nowhere, far from his sprawling estate, his office, and the orderly life he'd built brick by brick over decades. He had tried calling roadside assistance twice. No signal. The irony wasn't lost on him, a man who had built empires with the flick of a pen, now powerless on the side of a country road. Then, through the wavering heat, a figure emerged. A boy, maybe 13 or 14, with a backpack slung over one shoulder, walked with a purposeful stride toward him. Matthew watched as the boy drew closer, noticing his worn-out sneakers, the faded T-shirt that clung to his skinny frame, and the confident gleam in his eye. There was no hesitation in the boy's step as he approached the idling Mercedes. "Got a flat?" the boy asked, his voice steady and even, not the least bit tentative. Matthew blinked off guard. "Wes," he said, clearing his throat. "I do. I was trying to get help, but..." He gestured to his phone on the passenger seat, the screen still displaying no service. The boy nodded as though he'd seen this 100 times. "I can help with that," he said casually and walked to the rear of the car, crouching beside the tire. Matthew hesitated. "Do you know what you're doing?" The boy grinned. My grandpa taught me last summer. We fix stuff all the time." He motioned toward the trunk. "You got a spare?" Matthew popped the trunk, watching with mild disbelief as the boy pulled out the tools and the replacement tire with ease. In no time, the boy had loosened the lug nuts, removed the damaged tire, and fit the spare into place. His movements were efficient, practiced, and without unnecessary flair. He wiped his hands on his jeans when he was done and stood, giving Matthew a small, satisfied smile. "All set," the boy said, as if he'd just handed him his morning coffee instead of getting him out of a potentially dangerous situation. Matthew pulled out his wallet, fingers instinctively leafing through a wad of bills. "Here," he said, holding out a generous handful. "I appreciate the help." The boy shook his head, raising a hand politely as he took a step back. "That's okay, sir. You don't have to pay me. I'm just glad to help." Matthew stood there, stunned, as the boy turned and walked back down the road, his pace unhurried. The bills still hovered in his hand, forgotten. He watched the boy disappear in the rearview mirror before sliding back behind the wheel, his mind uncharacteristically quiet. For the rest of the drive home, Matthew's thoughts were fixed on that boy. There was something in the way he carried himself, quiet dignity, maybe, that Matthew hadn't encountered in years. He'd dealt with titans of industry, wheeled and dealed in rooms lined with glass and steel, but no one had left him feeling quite like that kid had. There had been no angle, no expectation of something in return. It unsettled him in a way he couldn't explain. That night, Matthew sat in his study, the clock ticking softly behind him. His untouched dinner cooled on the tray beside his chair as he stared at the decanter of scotch in front of him. Normally, he enjoyed these moments, the solitude of his mansion, the quiet pride of a life well earned. But now, everything around him felt hollow. The boy's face lingered in his mind, his simple act of kindness echoing louder than any business deal he'd ever made. The next morning, he found himself back behind the wheel, driving the same stretch of road where he'd broken down. His gut told him it was foolish, but he couldn't shake the need to find that boy again. He asked around at gas stations, diners, anywhere someone might have seen him. Most people shrugged until finally, in a small cafe, An older woman pointed him toward Harlan. "Sounds like Elijah," she said, drying a coffee mug with a rag. "Lives with his mama out that way. Good kid." The name stuck with him as he drove the hour to Harlan. The town was modest, its buildings old but well cared for. There were no high-rises or country clubs here, only simple homes and small shops. When he finally found the house, worn but neatly kept, he sat in his car for a full minute before getting out. He wasn't used to feeling nervous. Business negotiations never rattled him, but this wasn't business. He knocked lightly. A woman opened the door, her eyes tired but kind. She was younger than he expected, though life had clearly been no gentle companion to her. "I met your son yesterday," Matthew began. "Elijah." He helped me with a flat tire. Her expression softened. "That sounds like him," she said, holding the door open. "He's out back if you want to say hello." The inside of their home was simple but welcoming. Family photos, handmade drawings, a patchwork of memories layered on the walls. It smelled of home, cooked meals, and something Matthew hadn't felt in years: warmth. He followed her to the backyard where Elijah was mending a sagging fence. He straightened when he saw Matthew. "Hey, mister," Elijah said with a grin. "What are you doing here?" Matthew smiled back, the gesture almost foreign on his face. "I wanted to thank you properly." Elijah shrugged. "You don't have to." But Matthew felt he did. More than that, he wanted to. They talked, sitting on old chairs under the shade of a tree. Elijah told him about his life. His dreams of becoming an engineer, how he helped his mom with the house, how they'd gotten by after his grandfather passed. It was a world away from Matthew's, but as they spoke, he realized something. Elijah had more wealth in his character than most of the men Matthew had ever met in boardrooms. "I'd like to help," Matthew said finally. "If you'd let me." At first they resisted. They didn't want charity, but he wasn't offering that. He was offering gratitude, respect, and a chance to give back to someone who had reminded him what mattered. In the days that followed, Matthew returned with contractors and builders. He arranged for repairs on the house, upgrades that made daily life a little easier. At first, Elijah insisted on helping with the work, and before long he was learning about construction from the crew. His enthusiasm was contagious, his curiosity endless. Matthew found himself spending more time there than at his own estate. Each visit felt like shedding a heavy coat he hadn't realized he'd been wearing. Here, there was laughter, hard work, and genuine connection, things he hadn't made time for in years. And somewhere in the process, Matthew found something else. Purpose. By the time the house was finished, it wasn't just wood and nails holding it together. It was community, love, and hope. Elijah's mother stood on the new front porch, tears in her eyes as she thanked him. But Matthew shook his head. "No," he said quietly. "Thank you." Elijah beamed at him, and for the first time in a long while, Matthew knew he'd made a lasting difference. Not with his money, but with his time, his heart. And in doing so, he found himself again. As he drove away from Harlan that evening, he realized this wasn't goodbye. It was the beginning of something far more valuable than anything he'd ever built in business. A legacy of kindness passed from one person to the next. The weeks after the renovations brought a Matthew hadn't expected, but welcomed all the same. Every few days, he found himself back in Harlan, though no longer as a visitor, but as someone the town had come to accept as their own. He wasn't just dropping in to check on construction progress anymore. He was showing up for community events, sitting on porches sharing iced tea, and watching kids kick up dust as they raced along the roads on their bikes. For a man who had lived much of his life in the isolation of luxury, it was jarring. Yet it filled a hollow space in him he hadn't realized was there. Elijah had taken to shadowing Joe, the burly contractor who ran the renovation crew. The boy's interest in building had evolved into something more serious. He carried around an old leather notebook Matthew had given him, sketching out ideas for small projects he wanted to try. Birdhouses, benches, even rough blueprints for a new community center the town was desperate for. Joe let him measure, hammer, and saw under careful supervision, often nodding in approval at the boy's natural knack for the work. One afternoon, Matthew found himself sitting on the steps of Elijah's newly repaired porch, watching as the boy and Joe went over plans for a shed in the backyard. Elijah's hands moved as he spoke, explaining why he thought they should add more support beams. Joe nodded, giving him a grin of approval. Matthew smiled quietly to himself. He couldn't remember the last time he'd felt this kind of pride for something unrelated to profit margins or quarterly returns. "Penny for your thoughts?" Elijah's mother asked, stepping onto the porch with 2 glasses of lemonade. He took one gratefully. "I was just thinking," he said after a sip, "about how this place has changed. How much it's changed me." She sat beside him, her eyes following her son. "He's been different since you came around," she said softly. "Not because of the house or the new things, because someone believed in him. Someone outside of me." Matthew was quiet for a moment. "You've done a remarkable job raising him," he said. "I only nudged what was already there." Later that evening, as the sky shifted from brilliant orange to dusky blue, Elijah joined Matthew on the porch. He was tired. His hands smudged with dirt and paint, but he was grinning from ear to ear. "You think I could really be an engineer one day?" he asked suddenly, without preamble. Matthew turned to him, meeting his hopeful gaze. "I think you already are one," he said. "You just need the paperwork to make it official." Elijah laughed at that, but it was a laugh that carried something more. Hope, ambition, belief. They talked about college, scholarships, and plans for the future until the stars blinked to life above them. By the time Matthew left that night, he had made arrangements for a trust fund in Elijah's name. It wasn't charity, it was an investment. Not in dollars and cents, but in a life he believed would change more than just his own. Months passed. Seasons changed. Matthew's visits to Harlan became less about obligation and more about joy. He brought books on engineering, kits for building small machines, and even arranged for Elijah to meet with a civil engineer who worked for one of his old firms. And then one spring day, a letter arrived at Matthew's mansion. The envelope was thick, the return address stamped from a university 2 states away. Inside, the letter confirmed what Matthew had already hoped for. Elijah had been accepted to an engineering program on a full scholarship. Matthew drove to Harlan that afternoon, the acceptance letter tucked neatly into his jacket pocket. When he arrived, Elijah was on the porch, a pile of wood shavings at his feet as he sanded down a project he was working on. Matthew held up the letter without a word. Elijah took it, his hands trembling slightly as he read. His face broke into a smile that was all teeth and joy. He whooped, dropping the sandpaper and leaping to his feet before pulling Matthew into an impulsive hug. Matthew chuckled, clapping the boy's back. "You did this, Elijah?" he said. "All I did was remind you." The celebration that night was simple but heartfelt. Neighbors came by with casseroles and pies. There was laughter, music, and for the first time in a long while, Matthew felt like he was exactly where he was supposed to be. As the years passed, Elijah went on to become the engineer he always dreamed of. He worked on projects that improved his hometown, repairing roads, building new schools, and eventually designing that community center he had once scribbled into his notebook. And through it all, Matthew stood by, no longer the benefactor, but family. At Elijah's graduation, Matthew was there, front row, his hands clapping harder than anyone else's. He remembered the day they met on that lonely road. How a flat tire and a boy's simple act of kindness had set everything in motion. Years later, long after Matthew's hair had turned silver and Elijah had kids of his own, they sat together on that same porch. Elijah's son was working on a small wooden project nearby, his tongue sticking out in concentration as he hammered nails into place. "You did good, Elijah," Matthew said, his voice softer now but still strong. Elijah glanced at him and smiled. "We did good," he corrected, and Matthew knew he was right. Because life wasn't about the wealth he had accumulated or the empire he had built. It was about the people whose lives he'd touched and who had touched his in return. It was about the legacy of kindness passed down, a reminder that what you give always finds its way back to you. Even if it starts with something as simple as a flat tire on a hot Kentucky road.